What's your thoughts on government cover-ups or covert societies attempting to control humanity? Do you believe in ancient astronauts, intergalactic communication, or extraterrestrial visitations? Ever had an experience with disembodied spirits or the paranormal universe? Are these subjects fact or fiction? Each week, Tony and Eddie explore these unbelievable realities and beyond. Exclusively on Truth Be Told.
Welcome to Truth Be Told, where we believe an experience becomes truth. I'm your host, Tony Sweet, and here with me, your other host, world-renowned psychic Eddie Connor. We want to thank you for supporting our sponsors. For over 40 years, Earth-friendly products have brought you the greenest home products for your family needs. Go to ecos.com, that's ecos.com.
Take your mind on a literary journey to adventuresunlimitedpress.com to purchase books from many of our famed experts featured here on Truth Be Told.
Egypt has and always will be one of the world's biggest mysteries. Tonight we have the leading authority and proponent of Symbolist School of Egyptology.
John Anthony West is a writer, scholar, and Pythagorean born in New York City. He is also the author of The Traveler's Key to Ancient Egypt and a consulting editor for the Traveler's Key series. John Anthony West is also an independent Egyptologist who won an Emmy for his documentary Mystery of the Sphinx, which was hosted by Academy Award winner Charlton Heston.
The ancient Egyptians themselves attributed their wisdom to an early age going back 36,000 years. West set out to test the hypothesis that the Sphinx was much older than its conventional date of 2500 BC.
His findings provide the first hard evidence that an earlier age of civilization preceded the known development of civilization in the Nile Valley. Today, John is the leading authority and proponent of the Symbolist School of Egyptology. Please help us welcome author, lecturer, guide, and Emmy Award winner, John Anthony West.
The crowd goes wild for the John Anthony West. How you doing, John?
Doing fine.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, Eddie and I are both honored to have you on the show. It really is a pleasure.
Well, my pleasure to be on. So there you are.
We're both in the right area. Okay, so let's get started. John, you've been really a leading expert in the field of Egyptology, and I want to go back to where you started. Where did you start your passion for this field and this country and this artifacts?
It's a long story, but to cut it very, very short, not with Egypt. I was, you might say, psychologically precocious. Genius, but psychologically precocious. And at the age of 13, which is long ago, I realized that I'd been born into a lunatic asylum.
Join the crowd.
By the time, now everybody knows it, but back then they called it progress. By the time I was 19, I know what I wanted to do. I wanted to be the little boy who said the emperor has no clothes. I wanted to let everybody know that it really was a lunatic asylum and the worst of the lunatics were in charge. Anyway, my chosen modality for that was writing, but not scholarship. I started out as a novelist, playwright, scriptwriter, satirist mainly, and had a lot of things done. Nothing that made any money, otherwise I probably wouldn't have gotten into Egypt. And when my first short story was published or accepted back in 1957, I was wildly in love with a woman who wouldn't have me, thank God. and otherwise I'd have stayed here. And I took off for Europe, where I'd already been a year and a half in the American Army. Needless to say, drafted, not enlisted. And I went back to Europe and found my way to this amazing island called Ibiza, now famous as sort of the party capital of the world. It was a party capital then too, in a sense. It had a thriving little colony of artists and writers, most of whom were just drunk all the time. But anyway, they said they were artists and writers, and a few of us got some work done. In the process of living there, I ran across, first took an interest, again, long story, but I won't get into it, in astrology. Well, it takes too long. And in astrology, and that led me, by another series of strange coincidences, to an interest in the Gurdjieff work. And I don't know if you know about Gurdjieff.
I don't.
Amazing. Okay, you know, everybody should know. It's not everybody's cup of metaphysics, you might say, but it was mine and still is. And Gurdjieff was talking all the time about ancient civilizations being infinitely more civilized than our own. In fact, what attracted me to Gurdjieff was he was the only person I'd ever met, albeit posthumously, who had who was as contemptuous of Western civilization as I was. But there was a big difference. He knew how to live in it, and I didn't. And, subsequently, I've learned to cope with it pretty well. Anyhow, one thing led to another. I moved from Ibiza after being there for 9 years to England, and there had a novel published that I'd been working on in Ibiza all along. I was friendly with my editor, who is very opposite me and very much rationalist, materialist, scholar, ex-mathematician turned publisher, turned editor, really. And we were having a jar in a pub one night, and the subject of astrology came up, and he said, "Oh, that's a bunch of codswallop." And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, it isn't. I know rather a lot about it, and there's a certain amount of evidence, some of it direct, more of it indirect, that if you put it together, you'd have a case for astrology." And he said, "Well, that interests me. Let me see." So I brought in the evidence, and he said, well, he wasn't convinced, but he thought it was very interesting, and would I do a book? And my answer was basically the same as it would always be: pay me some money and I'll write a book about it.
Attaboy.
Not quite true, but it's not that far off. Anyway, in doing the research for the book that would subsequently be called The Case for Astrology, through the Gurdjieff group that I was associated with, I came across the amazing French genius, Egyptologist, not Egyptologist really, Orientalist, practicing alchemist, the genius with the unpronounceable name, R.A. Schwaller de Lubix, and his Temple of Man. And I actually had entry-level French at that time. I had to go across town to the British Museum every day, which I did for almost a year, getting out a copy of this book and with the dictionary by my side, going through what is now published, actually, with a brilliant translation, The Temple of Man. And I realized in reading that he, was corroborating in a scholarly fashion all of Gurdjieff's claims about, which taken on a take it or leave it basis. Gurdjieff did not bother with scholarship, that corroborated the existence of an ancient sacred science. And when the astrology book was published finally, publishers came to me because Schwaller wasn't available in English at that time, in English translation, and asked if I would do a book on Schwaller. And I said, yeah, you bet. That interested me, in fact, more than the astrology. And years later, everything takes me years, out came Serpent in the Sky. In doing the research, I ran across this one line that Schwaller was looking to prove that the ancient Egyptians knew what they were talking about when they talked about their civilization having begun tens of thousands of years earlier than the usual accepted date, which is around 3400 BC. And at the very end of this long chapter, scholarly chapter, he came out with a single line. He said, and of course, the Great Sphinx of Giza shows unmistakable signs of water erosion. And when I read that, the penny dropped in the slot. The rest of the argument was was brilliantly put together, but it was it was scholarship. It was a matter really of opinion. It wasn't science. And water weathering of the Sphinx, I'm not a geologist, but I knew that was in principle a scientific question that scientists could answer. So anyhow, I put that the long last chapter in the astrology book was devoted to Schwaller de Lubitsch and his symbolist interpretation, and that got publishers interested and said, would you do a book on Schwaller? And I said, yeah, you bet I will. And so that's how the whole Sphinx theory came about. And then years passed. Of course, nobody paid attention to my book, except for a few people who said very nasty things.
Yeah, of course.
If those of them who are still alive will get their own back somewhere along the line soon. And turning the other cheek is not one of my great fortes or accomplishments. And anyway, it took long, and I was friendly with an English teacher at Boston University who had spent time at American University of Cairo and become acquainted with my work in Symbolist Egypt, and we got to be friendly. And he was we were having a dinner one night, and he said, this symbolist point of view and Symbolist Egypt should be much better known. This is important stuff. And I said, yeah, I know. And he said, is there anything I can do in my position as an academic to help you? And I instantly said, yeah, find me an open-minded scientist, geologist, to look into the water weathering of the Sphinx. And I laughed. And he said, well, what are you laughing at? I said, because I knew from fairly substantial experience that finding an open-minded scientist is like finding a fundamentalist Christian who loves his enemies.
I knew where you're going with that one.
and he laughed. Or a billionaire with a conscience. Anyway, so he said, wait a minute. More long story cut very short. Eventually, I met up with Robert Schoch with his impeccable Yale double PhD and in geology and geophysics. And more long story, we got he came over to Egypt. We scratched together the money. We gave a presentation at the GSA, that's the Geological Society of America's annual meeting. This is sort of the Super Bowl of geology, held once a year, and presented our water weathering hypothesis, which instantly became a huge, this was front page science news, mainstream press, much of it surprisingly, given the nature of the press and its willingness, or indeed its almost its subservience to mainstream opinion, a pretty fair shake. And one thing led to another. And this is a very funny story in here, but we don't have time for it.
Oh, go ahead.
We love it.
Now you got us all.
We love it.
All right.
We're titillated. We're ready.
The press of the world was at this GSA meeting, and the GSA had called a press conference for our show, along with a few others, because they knew they had a hot ticket item. And so we were being interviewed. The geologists themselves were, in this instance, 100% convinced that we were absolutely correct. Of all of the people who came past our poster presentation, not one could find fault with it. But so this stuff was getting, instantly, with no internet in those days, it was 91. But the news was out there, and the press was relatively neutral. They were just presenting the evidence. But the Egyptologists and the archaeologists were in an uproar, in a rage about all of this. And we got interviewed. It was a telephone interview by the science editor of the Boston Globe. Schoch teaches at Boston University, still does. And Schoch was his usual gentlemanly, scholarly self. When they got me on, he asked, why is it that the geologists are all in favor of your theory, and the archaeologists and the Egyptologists are in a fury? You can't imagine the abuse they were hurling at us.
Right,
and,
sure.
And I said, well, this theory is based upon the patterns of weathering in rocks. And when it comes to patterns of weathering in rocks, the opinions of an archaeologist or an Egyptologist are no better than the opinions of a proctologist. And this they printed.
Oh,
And this did not endear us to the archaeology department of Boston University.
You weren't getting invitations, huh?
There was a female archaeologist, Egyptologist there who wrote an absolute character assassination of shock in their in-house journal. I mean, nobody outside saw it, but it was really vicious, and for no reason. And I said to Shock, you can't let them get away with this. And because the proctologist line absolutely got to them. And he said, no, it's, I have to work here, so forget it. And I said, well, do you mind if I write her a letter? So I wrote her a letter, and I said, I understand that, that you and your department took umbrage at the comparison to the proctologist. And I said, look, you shouldn't worry about this or be upset because the proctologist didn't like it either. They said their job was to cure sick assholes. They didn't like being compared to them. This did not have the calming effect that I was hoping for. And what she did was she sent this letter to the entire Egyptological and archaeological community. Talk about Brer Rabbit and the briar patch.
Oh my God.
So anyway, that started off this whole long ding dong that's been going on all of these more than 2 decades, 91, and now it's here we are 25 years later almost. But now we have, it's been going back and forth and back and forth. We gave another GSA presentation in 2000, but no press was there for that. We now have not just a smoking gun, we have an arsenal of smoking guns of absolutely solid evidence to do a massive, not just a follow-up, but kind of a major upgrade. It's a sequel and a totally different kettle of fish to the mystery of the Sphinx, which actually that original presentation at the GSA generated, because all of those headlines. So this was, this was a big deal. I mean, it was people, the whole globe was interested in this. And so all of a sudden there came the mystery of the Sphinx with Charlton Heston as the host. And this was a big success too. And I got an Emmy, and the thing was nominated for best documentary. It didn't get, but still the nomination counts. So anyway, we were, basically we were in the news, but now we have, as a follow-up, we now have a ton more evidence, because the only argument they put forward a number of geologists, a few with stakes in Egyptology, put forward alternative theories which range from this just merely stupid to the idiotic. And all of them, each of them completely rebuttable in turn. But the one argument that they had didn't really have any cogency to it, but it sounded good, was that it was impossible, despite the water weathering. They didn't care about geology. They weren't geologists. They weren't even proctologists, actually. Yeah. And they said, well, it was impossible no matter what, because it was all hunter-gatherers back then. And here's the most spectacular sculpture on earth with temples around it that we couldn't build today, with blocks of stone that weigh 150, 200 tons. Wow. Yeah. Put into place like pieces in a jigsaw puzzle. And here we were assigning to it an impossible date. It was practically impossible enough, even within the framework of dynastic Egypt. But recently, you guys probably know about the find in Turkey, which is only a few hundred miles away, called Gobekli Tepe. Oh yeah. Which consists of a big series. It's only about 5% excavated now, of about 23 quite massive stone circles, like mini Stonehenges, but not that many, made with central pillars weighing 12 to 15 tons, carved. Wow. Carved with elegant reliefs in high relief, which means it's the most difficult kind of sculpture to do, where the figures seem to be jumping out of the stone rather than cut into the stone. And they, the archaeologists, date this. It was deliberately covered over for reasons that nobody quite understands. There are theories. Deliberately covered over around 8,000, 8,500 BC. This is their dating, not us heretics. Their dating. So they, the archaeologists who are in charge of this, are dating it to at least 10,500 or so BC, and probably bits and pieces of it. Or there are earlier, probably they're excavating the later rather than the earlier stone circles. And anyway, so this is our major, we have loads of smoking guns, but this is the howitzer. Right. There's no arguing with this, that they might have been wearing bearskins and shooting rhinoceroses for lunch, but with bows and arrows, but they were capable of major feats of highly sophisticated and elegant stonework. And so, so much for hunter-gathering. So this is our smoking gun. There's no arguing with this because even they don't argue. So this is what we're looking to. We're looking to do this major follow-up for Mystery of the Sphinx. And I can say right here and now, if there is in the audience a friendly billionaire or even a multi-millionaire with vision and principles and a conscience, here's a chance to make even more money. Finding a billionaire with vision, principles, and a conscience is maybe even more difficult than finding an open-minded scientist and a fundamentalist Christian who loves his enemies. But nevertheless, I put the possibility out there.
Well,
anyway,
I always say
the Sphinx
if I had the money, I would put it up myself, because
lots of people who don't have the money.
I know, but it's the people like me that say that, but the ones that actually have it, they're like, yeah. Well, I have a question. I know you've heard this many times, and everybody that we've been on the show, that we ask the same thing. But Sharita in the chat room, we have a chat room where people can join, and right. This is, I think, one of the most common questions. My first one, she said, my first question would be your theory on who really built the pyramids. I know we touched on a little bit the hunters and gatherers, but who do you think built the pyramids and the Sphinx?
I would say whoever was in Egypt at the time.
Good answer. If I had
I don't know.
As above, so below.
And nobody knows. Really serious. I know it's funny, but
it's true.
It tended to be funny. But obviously somebody built it. We don't know. Put it this way: if that question is leading to aliens, no, I don't think it was aliens. It could be aliens. I mean, the UFO phenomenon, I accept. This is real. There's too much evidence. There's too much evidence that says it's real. However, there is no evidence, zero, that they are responsible for the pyramids and much else that is mysterious in Egypt. And to me, it's no argument to say, well, we couldn't do it. We can't do it now. So obviously we're more advanced than they were then. It's the opposite, actually. We're not more advanced than they are then.
That's right.
We have hydrogen bombs that they didn't have, and we have bobblehead dolls that they didn't have. But in every other significant aspect, we're less advanced than they were. So that's no argument that we couldn't do it, therefore it's aliens. And I don't know if you mentioned this, that I may be the lone contrarian out there.
At the contact in the desert.
There are some smart people coming there. I disagree with them, but they're smart. To the contact in the desert. Contact in the desert. Though there are a lot of stupid people who don't agree with me either. But these are different. These are smart people. And at Contact in the Desert out in Joshua Tree in California, and I'll be there in a few weeks, the end of May, with a lot of other people, Von Daniken among them. So anybody wants to get there, if you don't know about it, Google it up, Contact in the Desert, and come on out there, and I'll see you if you are.
No, I would love to. I hope to stop by. It's May 29th.
Well, you're close. You're in you're in LA?
Yeah, in LA. So hopefully.
You don't have an excuse not to.
I know, right? I like this guy.
I do too.
All right. So what was the first, because there's been archaeologists that have been studying for how many hundreds of years, probably the Egypt and the pyramids. What made you first think of the erosion that other people didn't see? What was the first?
That was Schwaller.
Schwaller. What did he see though?
Schwaller said, I mentioned,
In
I
the
think
book.
I did.
Yeah,
At
you
the
did.
end
Yeah.
of this long chapter talking about Egypt being an older civilization,
Right.
came out with this single line that was, oh yes. And of course, the Great Sphinx shows unmistakable signs of aquatic erosion. And the penny dropped in the slot. And I realized that that was potentially science, and all the rest of it was impeccable scholarship, but it wasn't science. And so that clicked into place, and that was it took years before I met Shock.
Right.
Yeah.
But basically that was it. And that actually, I mean, the geologists, with only a few exceptions, are completely in favor of the theory. The dating is another matter, when it was done and all the rest. And so we're hoping, if we can ever generate the money and the interest, to do a really major study of getting a whole bunch of geologists over there, those that agree with us and a few who disagree with us, and duke it out for a couple of weeks and see if we can solve this question, maybe not the specific dating itself, but solve the question of the water weathering once and for all. And a lot, this is not, this is not just a scholarly quibble.
Right.
It's not just a bunch of academics who disagree with each other. It much more hinges upon this, and that's where Schwaller's amazing scholarship comes in, and the whole question of Symbolist Egypt, because, as you know, I lead study trips, intensive study trips to Egypt, several of them a year, 3 or 4 of them a year. And now is a good time to go, by the way, because tourism is still down following the revolution, which I was there for the whole thing.
Nice.
That's one of my Phoenix Fire blogs. If you go to my website, jawest.net or .com, and find Phoenix Fire, the last episode called The 5-Star Revolution, because we were there for the whole thing right from the beginning, being quarantined in what's arguably the best hotel in Egypt, or maybe the world, but sitting there in the shadow of the pyramids, drinking lots of vodka and smoking illegal substances, watching all of this stuff unfolding on television, because everybody was going crazy. And we said, the hell with this, let's just wait a little while and see if it simmers down enough, and we get on with our trip, which we did. Anyway, lost my thread.
We were just talking about the theory again, and
with the theory, yeah, because what's at stake here is not just the disagreement, a quibble among scholars. It really has to do with understanding what our own civilization, which is, in my view, not a civilization at all. It's the Church of Progress, where it is assumed that we, with our hydrogen bombs and our striped toothpaste and our bobblehead dolls, are the most advanced beings that ever existed. And we couldn't, in fact, even if we wanted to, create another temple of Luxor or another Sphinx temple. So much more than that is involved. In fact, at Contact in the Desert, I've been working on this in my own chaotic fashion for a while. I'll be talking about what I call the 5 cowboys of Apocalypse 2.0.
Wow.
Everybody knows about the 4 horsemen. War, pestilence, war, famine, pestilence, and death. Well, those are sort of obvious. But the 5 cowboys, there's something else. Every one of them is played by John Wayne, and they all ride white stallions and wear white Stetson hats, and everybody thinks that they're the good guys. But they are, in fact, the 5 cowboys who are bringing on the destruction. I'll be talking about them because it is, in my opinion, unless we go back, we, meaning, I hate this when people say we, who's we? Unless enough people understand that we've been hornswoggled, we've been gulled into believing that science has the answers to why we human beings are on this planet. And the whole exercise, in their opinion, and they're quite proud of this, is entirely meaningless. The ancients saw it differently. They contended, they believed, and I don't say again, whenever you read anything about ancient Egypt or ancient India or ancient China that disagrees with us, the language always used by the scholars or the scientists involved is the Egyptians believed, or the American Indians believed, or the Chinese believed. It never occurs to them that, hey, maybe they knew, and it's we who believe, or at least the jackasses who are in charge of our education believe. They believe, they don't know. And my own conviction is that, I'll backtrack a little bit, Egypt is a one-issue civilization. Very easy in the sense to understand it. The issue was the quest for immortality. The understanding, I won't say belief, the understanding that we have a role to play, we as individuals and collectively, in the grand cosmic scheme. And until or unless enough people understand that is our role and do whatever is necessary in order, on an individual level and collectively, to do the best that they can to live according to those precepts, nothing is possible. In other words, even the best intentioned people in the world who are working against climate change and trying to help the animals and do all of the things that sensitive and well-meaning people do, without that philosophical or without that psychical, philosophical, spiritual understanding, nothing can happen.
That's right.
And nothing good can come out of it.
Exactly.
So my own role is, as I say it, is I'm one of the more vocal proponents of that understanding. And that's why I do it. If it were just to make fun of the Egyptologists, well, maybe I do it anyhow.
Well, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Truth Be Told on air with Tony Sweet. I'm Eddie Connor.
I'm Tony Sweet.
And we have with us right now, we're honored to have John Anthony West. John is an independent Egyptologist. He's also won an Emmy Award for his documentary titled Mystery of the Sphinx, which was hosted by Academy Award winner Charlton Heston. And we're learning an awful lot just in what little bit you've been with us. We have about another 15 minutes left. I love the fact that you definitely, it feels like your purpose in this life is to seek truth. And I like that you're not scared to rattle a couple of cages and ruffle a couple of feathers as you go. It also is refreshing, I have to say, John, that you have a great sense of humor. And for some reason, a lot of people in that world seem to have sticks up their butt. And so,
Yeah, well,
which
right.
is
But
good
you see,
because that's
I
why you need
started
proctologists.
But I'm a scholar by default, you see, and I'm
Yes.
really a satirist, genetically, you might say, or by nature.
Yeah.
So it's true. One of my strengths is that I can have fun doing this.
That's right.
And a lot of my colleagues, even quite brilliant ones, don't. I mean, they've never done stand-up comedy.
But don't
If
you?
you're in a field like Egyptology, the world is your oyster because everything that they do and say is a joke.
Yeah, that is hysterical.
So this is sort of fun for me, and I enjoy rattling the cages. I mean, satirists do. That's what we do.
Yes.
So I bring I bring something that they don't expect, which is good.
I think so
And,
too.
so yeah, but agreed that many of my colleagues, even those who are quite brilliant, don't have much fun with it, but I do. And see, some of them, a few of them even, would love it if the academics would suddenly recognize them. I'd be horrified if they recognized me. It means I'd have to be polite to them.
I'm liking John more and more.
Stuff. I mean, I feel the way a cannibal chieftain must feel watching a boatload of missionaries approach. It's more than food for thought. It's food for food.
Oh, that's funny.
And, yeah, seriously. So I realize that I have a certain, by my both instinct and by my own experience, because as I said, for years I got into Egypt when I was relatively young, middle 30s or thereabouts, but until then I was writing ferocious satire and films, and as I said, making no money, but writing a lot of interesting stuff. One of my big regrets actually is that I've never had, nothing that I ever wrote got to the audience that I know is still sitting there for it. Films that almost got made and didn't, plays that were produced and badly produced, and weird things happened, stuff that got published in the middle of a newspaper strike or something like that. So sooner or later, I reckon that I will have outlived the gremlins. They can only live, I don't know what the life expectancy of a gremlin is, but I've got to be close to outliving them. And the advantage to that is if it really does happen, and it might, if you know your astrology a little bit, yep. Uranus return is coming back to me in a little over a year. And I sort of have hope for that. If you know your astrology, if you don't, it doesn't mean anything to you. But
yeah,
anyway, the advantage is I can no longer be spoiled by premature success. So well, we will see.
We've had some phenomenal astrologers on the show. We've had Deborah Clement, we've had Rachel Lang. And one of the things that fascinates me about astrology, which we've talked to Deborah about a few times, and Deborah's really good about doing a birth chart with the United States and then certain states within the United States. And then we talk about, I ask her the question innocently. I'm like, why does history continue to repeat itself? And she says, because the planets always come back in the exact same positions every X number of years. And then that will also bring up some of the same upheavals as it did back in the time or back in the day. And that's one of the reasons history repeats itself.
Oh, no, I forget who it was that said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And they never come back to the same position because the position of the solar system itself within the precessional cycle, things don't actually repeat until the precessional cycle comes back to itself in 26,000 years. It's always against the backdrop of zodiacal factors. And the whole thing is really very, very mysterious, but the moon goes around, but even the moon has there are certain cycles of the moon. Yes. There's one, if I have it correct, I think it's called, the Saros cycle. That's 19 years, which has something to do, because, the moon goes all over the place. And it's also a cycle, but it's 19 years before the moon, let's say that it's the full moon. I'm not sure if it's the spring equinox, something like that, where it comes back to the exact same spot that it was before. In other words, every full moon takes place on a different spot within the solar system. And it takes 19 years for it to shine down on the same spot. And in Sardinia, for example, which is one of the best kept secrets in terms of megalithic monuments, there's an incredible shrine there, or well, with a hole cut in the ceiling. And that's tuned to the Saros cycle. Every 19 years, I don't know which year that 19 is, every 19 years, the full moon comes down on the spring equinox on that hole. Wow. So, yeah, so there's a ton of such stuff out there that is really, it's becoming a cottage industry. I mean, with the Sphinx, the one thing about the Sphinx theory is that it really is the most glamorous of the theories. It is the most spectacular sculpture on Earth, and the water weathering is the water weathering. So it really is a perfect, you might say it's the perfect scholarly general on a white horse leading the charge. But then once you're into it, once you really get involved in this, you start gathering the evidence. And this is what we hope to do in our follow-up to Mystery of the Sphinx. Oh. Maybe as a documentary theatrical release, maybe there's so much evidence, maybe as a miniseries, we don't know. But we're looking for that enlightened billionaire. Good luck.
Honestly, John, I have a feeling you're going to end up pulling to you a team of people, and I feel you being on TV more, and I feel like it's either in association with something. It could be on the History Channel or H2 or whatever, and then them bringing you in and doing segments. But there's really there's 2, 3, 4, 5 seasons worth of information just in what you're giving, and you're different than everybody else out there who's doing what you're doing. You've got that sense of humor.
Well, yeah.
Now, just for fun, I'm curious, what is your sun sign and what is your moon sign?
Well, the sun sign is Cancer.
Okay.
Is it 21 Cancer? Moon sign is Virgo.
Oh.
But that's not
And your
rising sign is also Cancer.
oh wow.
But the real strength of it is really the planets where Jupiter, Uranus, Pluto, the Sun, and the Moon are very closely connected in a kind of a bow-like formation, but really very closely. That's why before I wasn't kidding when I said that the Uranus return,
Yes.
meaning it comes back to 23.14 Aries, and right on my 84th birthday, more or less, which is when, when it's supposed to. It's an 84-year cycle,
Wow.
but it will also coincide at that time with an exact Leo aspect. Anyway, it's a thing that if there's anything to this science at all, and I think there is,
Yeah.
should have some sort of results. But the nature of this peculiar formation is that whenever anything good happens, something bad also happens. So
Yeah.
watch out.
So
Let's see.
So now we have about 4 minutes left. I want to make sure everybody knows you have a previous book that's out called Serpent in the Sky. It's
Yes.
the High Wisdom of Ancient Egypt. You also, which I'm going to check these out, you also have The Case for Astrology, which I love how you spoke about that.
It's out of print, but we're bringing it back into print. The Traveler's Key is also out of print, but I'm updating that. That will be back in print. But people should know also, I don't know if you guys have seen it, the wonderful Magical Egypt series, the 8 DVD series that got pirated from us.
No,
So,
I
I mean,
haven't.
you can see, oh, well, this is typical, and my absolutely brilliant partner in this, Chance Gardner, who lives now in Australia. But Google that up, because that's, I mean, if you don't see John Line, if you don't see Egypt through symbolist eyes, you don't see Egypt at all. Egypt itself ought to be a pilgrimage, not just a visit, but a pilgrimage for anybody interested in these ideas. Because, again, I often start a lecture by saying Egypt is like sex. That gets everybody's attention. And why is it like sex? Well, because you can read all about it, and that's informative and a bit interesting. And you can look at pictures, and that's informative from another point of
And
view.
arousing.
Also very interesting. But until you actually experience it, you cannot understand it. Not really. You cannot understand it at all. And so Egypt is like that. It's the books and the videos are fascinating, but until you actually see Egypt, you don't understand what a civilization was actually like. And Egypt is different from the other ancient civilizations that were probably just as advanced, but there's not that much left of them. So you can't go day after day after day after day visiting these unbelievable resonating, I hate to use the word spiritual, but these resonating incredible places. And at the end of a couple of weeks, you understand the difference between civilization and what these jackasses call progress. So plug for the trips for anybody who can afford them and has the time.
Yes, we were going to ask
them
you.
on my website. But meanwhile, the Magical Egypt series, which you can get, and I think there are pirated versions as well. But we buy it. don't steal
Yes.
it.
Absolutely
Please
buy it and support it. Create that exchange of energy.
It is the closest you can get to experiencing Egypt without actually being there. It's really an extraordinary production by my partner, and this is an absolutely brilliant 3D TV 3D animator, Chance Gardner, and it's have a couple of tokes before you watch it.
That is so fun. And then we'll make sure, Tony and I want everybody to have
Yeah,
multiple
seriously.
Egypt orgasms.
Right. And go to jawest.net. You can find out all the information,
Right.
books, appearances, and don't forget May 29th through
Yes.
the 30th, I believe, at Contact in the Desert. Go to contactinthedesert.com. Going to be some great speakers there. What are you going to be speaking on again at the Contact in the Desert?
Well, I mean, in part, the usual, the geology, the Sphinx,
Mm-hmm.
and then a fairly extensive, insofar as is possible in the time allowed, introduction to Symbolist Egypt. And then I will be, this is a work in progress, talking about, and I think there's an intensive thing. I've got 3 gigs there. The intensive thing on the 5 cowboys of Apocalypse 2.0.
Looking forward to
So
that.
that should be fun.
That should be fun, and we want you back. There's so much more to talk about, and I know,
Yes.
but you are such a fascinating man, and I love, like Eddie said, your humor keeps everybody really focused on what you're saying, and because laughter does bring everybody to the
It's a
table,
healing
so.
frequency. Plus, it's titillating.
That's right. Well, that's an interesting subject in its own right, which we can explore in a subsequent
Yeah.
program.
All right, well, John,
Thank you,
thank
John.
you so much. John Anthony West, everybody. Say that one more time.
Do you have a live audience there?
Oh yeah, we
Yep.
have a no way.
Oh,
We have a bunch of people in the chat room for sure.
Yeah,
I see. Okay.
yeah, they in the chat room they said they loved you anyway.
Aw.
They loved your voice. They said we love his voice.
Yes.
They love and they
Okay.
love the library behind you.
Oh, yeah.
Did you write all those books behind you?
No, but I read most of them.
Oh. All right, sir. Well,
Thanks,
you're
John.
the best. Thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you, Tony.
All right,
See
take
ya.
care.
Bye.
Bye.
See you again. Take care. Bye.
Very nice. Very nice.
I love this guy.
I do too.
I love this guy.
I find that people who I like that he didn't have the background that most everybody else who does what he does. He was sort of it's like his soul pulled him into it,
Right.
and then he took off. So he's thinking outside the box right at the get go, and he obviously wants to have fun
Oh, definitely.
and
You can
wants the
tell.
people around him to experience the same frequency, whether they like it or not. I
He
love
kept
that.
us laughing. Yeah.
and it's not the kind of subject most people could keep you laughing at. So
No, I mean we've had people on, and great information, but it's also in the presentation.
yeah,
Great information is not always entertaining.
and you got to love what you do to be able to do what John just did.
Well, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna take about a 13-second break, and Eddie's gonna be doing Unlock the Universe Within.
Yep.
So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Truth Be Told. I'm Tony Sweet.
I'm Eddie Connor.
All right, here we go.